Welcome to 2819. This is the show where we aim to inspire you to go and make disciples of all nations. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher, and this is the television outreach of Reasons to Believe, a viewer-supported ministry where science and faith converge.
And you know, as you're watching the show, if you're enjoying what you're watching, please visit reasons.org/2819 and give us some support.
Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button below. Stay up to date on all the new videos Reasons to Believe is producing.
And also be sure to find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear from you.
And as always, the podcast version is available. We're on Apple Podcasts and Google Play, and now Spotify. So make sure you check that one out if you're a Spotify user. I hear all the kids are doing it these days.
I love Spotify.
So just search Reasons to Believe podcast to find us there.
Well, now I think it's about time for our rundown, right?
Let's do it.
In our Nexus segment, we're going to hear from medical doctor Nick Tavani, and he's going to address the topic of special needs and the image of God.
And in Culture Talk, Sandra will be talking with Grant Gates, who's an MDiv student at Master's Seminary, about Christianity and the show Tidying Up.
With Marie Kondo. It's a great show. People are watching it. So
I've heard a lot about it, so this should be interesting.
And then in our Give and Take segment, Jeff will talk with astronomer Hugh Ross on why would God have ice ages on Earth.
First up, we have RTB 101. Anastasia will be interviewing astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink about can we prove God exists. Let's check that out.
Now it's time for RTB 101. This is the segment where we talk about practical questions to equip our viewers to share their faith with their friends and family more effectively. I'm Anastasia Young, and I'm here with astrophysicist Jeff Zweerink. And today, we'll be asking the question, can we prove God exists? And Jeff, I'm excited because this is right up your alley. You're a Christian. Mm-hmm. You're a scientist.
Yes, I am.
You work for Reasons to Believe.
I do.
So I've got 3 for 3 here.
Right.
So what you do all day is you seek to prove that God exists.
Yes and no. So you can't say, no, I don't look for evidence that God exists, because that is what I do. But it's the idea of proving there, because there are only a few places where we can prove something where this, and it's got to be this, and there's no way around it. But what we do is I spend a lot of time looking for evidence that God exists. And so we're asking the question, what's the best explanation for all the evidence we have out there? And so we do build a case that God exists, but I don't like that word prove, if you will.
Well, then I need to ask you, what's the key difference between proving something and evidence for it?
So proof is something you do in geometry. I don't know if you ever remembered your geometry classes, but if you can show this and then you show this, then you got the side angle side says that this triangle's got to be. Those are proofs. There's given this and this has to be true. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have something that probes and says, oh, this is God. You know, we don't have a God meter, if you will. But what we do have is we have a creator who created the universe, who built it and fashioned it and held it a certain way that we can go investigate, and then we can say, given all that we've measured, what's the best explanation? In fact, you know, that's the way science works. We never prove stuff. We go out and say, what is the best explanation for all the evidence we have?
And so that's one of the critiques about science, is that they're always changing what they believe.
It is, and I find that an odd critique, because you know, what we do is we look and we say, all right, here's the evidence we have, here's the best explanation. We say, if that's true, then this is what we ought to find. And so we go out, and if we find that, then that gives us more confidence that our explanation is correct. But if we find a new piece of evidence that says, no, we're incomplete, we either need to go back and modify and change it. That, to me, is the sign of someone who's got a healthy belief system, because they're not so dogmatic that they're set regardless of what the evidence says. And they're open and willing to refining what they have. And I find as Christians, we've got the best foundation to do that.
Well, wouldn't you say that the proof and evidence is a little bit different for us as Christians? I mean, shouldn't we be able to say proof, since what we know doesn't change?
So in anything we do, we're looking, I mean, even, you know, let's take a look at something that all Christians agree on. We've got the Bible there. We believe that it's an inspired, inerrant word of God, that it is true in all that it says. But yet when we look at it, we still have to look and say, okay, we've got to interpret what the words mean. Now, there are certain things that we have far more confidence that, yeah, this is what it means, and other places where we say, we don't know. You know, you talk about the Nephilim or the extent of the flood, or there's a whole lot of things where it's like there's open for interpretation of what's the best explanation there. That doesn't mean that, you know, and you get that openness because you've looked at Scripture and say, okay, this matches better, this meets this criteria. And so you're doing that even with Scripture. So the idea that though we can be confident the Bible is true, that doesn't mean we have everything nailed down. We're 100% confident of everything it says. I find if God is the inspiration for Scripture, and I'm convinced He is, that He's given that He's the author of creation, we ought to see a similar scenario there, that we're going to go look, find out what's there, and as we get more data, it's going to help us hone in on the better picture, or the more complete picture. But we're always going to have ways that it might be different. And so that's what's exciting about science, is that we're never going to run out of stuff to test. But yet we're going to continue to show more and more what's actually going on.
Well, when defending the faith, isn't proof a much stronger, more powerful word than, oh, I have some evidence?
It is and it isn't. And so if you can prove something, then by all means state it. But I don't think God is provable in that sense. But what I find, if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I've proven this, my first response is, oh, really? Let me show you where you're wrong. And so that's kind of why I avoid that proof. I will state pretty confidently, I think I'm completely convinced that the Bible's true. Here's why I think it is. Or I think all the evidence points to there being a creator. So I think you can state that pretty strongly. But for me personally, and I think a lot of scientists, when you say I've proven something, their immediate response is, well, let me poke holes at that. I don't know whether I believe that or not. And so to avoid that rabbit trail or that getting distracted off to that, I think there's better ways to say it that engage people into the conversation about what you really want to talk about is who is God and how do we relate to Him. So I avoid that word proof just for that reason, because I want to get to that conversation. Who do you think God is? What are you going to do with Him?
Final question is, do you have any examples or stories from yourself or that you've experienced where there would be an example of how careful choosing between proof and evidence can actually help us be more credible when sharing the gospel?
I will give a brief story. So I was at a conference once, guys giving a talk on the origin of life. Initially, I was kind of a little bit sarcastic or a little bit judgmental of what he was saying. But eventually, I kind of settled down. And at one point in time, I just asked him a question. At what point in time would you be able to tell the difference between a created origin of life and a supernatural and a naturalistic origin of life? And it was interesting because it was the fact that I asked a question and how would you probe that opened up a whole lot of conversation later with a bunch of scientists who probably would not have engaged that question. So just being able to not have to dogmatically assert, but to invite them into the conversation allowed me to have an opportunity to share more of what Christianity had to say. And so that's kind of what I'm getting at there. If you say proof, more times than not, it's going to get into an argument, my experience. But if you can invite people into that conversation, hey, what do you think about all this evidence? Then I find you're more likely to have a fruitful conversation where you get to the central issues, again, of who is God and what are you going to do with Him.
And that's what we want, is open conversations, not just a dogmatic statement.
Right.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jeff. If you'd like to hear more from Jeff, check out his blog by visiting reasons.org and search Impact Events. Next up is the Nexus segment, where Dr. Nick Tavani shares with us about how do people with special needs reflect the image of God.
But when we talk about the image of God, the first thing that comes to mind is we're made in His image because we're intellectual, we're creative, we can speak, we have language, all of these high things, which is correct. But then I looked up a passage in the Scripture. It's Jesus. When He's presented with His disciples say, here's a blind man, he's been born since birth. Is it his fault or his parents? And Jesus' response resonated in my heart. Jesus said, He's there. It's neither of their fault. He said, He's here to show the works of God. I said, here's Jesus saying a special needs person is there to show the works of the Lord. And that transferred over to any special needs person, that we should be seeing how are they going to show the works of God. Then I went on further to think of Jesus' life, that He is the express image of God. But what do we think of when we think of Christianity? The strongest image is that of the cross. And of Jesus on the cross. I realize Jesus on the cross is in the weakest position. I mean, that's the most humiliating, weakest, helpless position you could be. And yet that's the strongest image of God presented through the Son of God to us. That began to speak to me a lot too. That the ghastly cross was also the glory of the cross. And I put that together in a way, of course, Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to the Father, and he's going to return and left his Spirit among us. And I'm just wondering if that Spirit of Christ that was present that day when he was with the blind man and interacting with him, the relational image of God, if that's not present in a real way as soon as you encounter someone with a special needs, it's as much about you as it is about them. If you're thinking they're the ones with special needs, really, you may have a special need. And the only way that can be met in you or built in your character is for you to interact with that person.
If you'd like to hear more from Nick Tavani and others in our scholar community, visit reasons.org and search for our Voices blog. Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of science, faith, and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. We are joined by Grant Gates. Welcome, Hi. Grant. Thank you so much for joining us. So you are in your last semester about to receive your MDiv, right?
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. I want to just talk about the blog post that I saw. So on your blog, it's Citizens and Sons. You had written a really cool article tying together Marie Kondo's Tidying Up with Romans 1. Like, that was really cool. So first, let's dive into the show. For those who aren't familiar, Marie Kondo's Tidying Up. What is that?
So Marie Kondo is just really good at organizing her stuff. Mm-hmm. And she came over and took a system that kind of her family had developed over a long time for cleaning things up and kind of reducing the amount of stuff you have to improve your connection with your stuff, and started teaching it to people in the US. And after writing a book, she got a show on Netflix where she goes into these family homes or family apartments and teaches them how to use her method to reorganize their lives. That's great.
Yeah, and you know, it's really hugely popular. You've seen people probably on Facebook or social media saying, you know, I KonMari'd my dresser today, or I have huge bags of stuff to give to the thrift store. And it's all kind of sparked because of this show, Tidying Up. But it also has some Eastern practices. So can you explain what we see on the show?
Yeah, so what I saw as I watched it is that the first time she visits a family home, no matter whose home it is, she takes some time to get down and kneel on the floor, and it's very much like our like traditional prayer position. And then she takes some time to thank the house, and she thanks the house for being a good home. And then later in the show as well, whenever they're going through the items that they're going to get rid of, they pick up each item that they no longer want and they thank it for its service, and then they put it aside. So these just struck me as foreign and unusual. I wouldn't do this, but I could tell it came from a lot of the traditional Eastern practices and sort of like Shinto and spiritualism type things.
Right. And so it was this kind of fascinating show to see that, you know, some very good things that we would say as Christians. It's very good to be responsible with our possessions and to not accumulate things for the sake of, you know, maybe having more than the Joneses. But then these other practices of thanking our house and thanking our objects, that kind of raised some eyebrows, right?
Yeah, I think there are people who would kind of overreact and maybe try to turn off the show because of that. But I think most of us just felt it was a little weird. But if you stop and ask yourself, why does she do that? It's not really just because she's Japanese or just because she comes from that tradition. It's because in the human heart, we have to worship something and we have to give gratitude to something. So instead of directing that attention and that glory to the creator, she's redirecting that to the creation, to the item. And that's kind of the connection to Romans 1.
Yeah. So delve into that connection, the connection of Romans 1 and how we understand that desire to give gratitude.
Yeah, at the beginning of Romans, Paul's making an argument for why everyone is sinful and everyone needs a savior. Nobody can work their way into heaven. Nobody can justify themselves and be right with the law. So first he starts with a general category of every nation but the Jews. And he starts by arguing that everybody can look around at creation and see God made this. There's a God who did this and you need to be thankful to him. But instead, they directed that gratitude, that worship to the creation instead. Their foolish hearts were darkened. And that's kind of what you see naturally happen whenever somebody directs their gratitude at their house instead of the God who gave them their house, or their gratitude at their clothes instead of the God who gave them their clothes. They're following that natural sinful tendency to worship the creature rather than the creator.
Right. And you know, we see that all throughout the Bible. I think of Luke 12:15 specifically, where we talk about just having gratitude and being mindful of the possessions that we have, and to not, again, like over accumulate things, that we are to be good stewards of our time, of our resources, and our finances. And I think shows like Tidying Up are great reminders in that sense, that we do want to declutter and kind of get rid of things that maybe we haven't been good stewards with our resources, reallocate those somewhere else, and then we have more time and space even in a house to maybe be hospitable to guests. Absolutely. Or have more resources too to then give to charities, or to give more time rather than spending your time just drowning in possessions, right?
Yeah, of course. And I think that's one of the biggest positives of her show, is that it has that natural impact on people's lives to help them live better lives. Yeah. All I wrote about is trying to think about, why are you doing what you're doing? And how can that tie into a greater purpose as well?
So if we're talking to someone who is really excited about the show and really excited about cleaning their house, like how would you have that conversation about the creator and the creation or creature, and, you know, a Christian view of decluttering and tidying up?
Yeah, so I think first it's worth just enjoying the show with people like that. It's a fun show to watch, and I still have trouble putting my finger on why it's so fun to watch people declutter their homes, but like, I haven't found someone who's been bored by this show yet. So take some time to enjoy it with them before you do anything else. But I think they know that they're not just thankful to the item for existing. Everyone naturally has some sort of sense of God. And so whatever you can do to say, hey, this gratitude you're directing at the item, you know that's not 100% directed at the item. You know that's not rational to say, I'm thankful to my shirt for existing. You know it would be rational to say someone gave me that shirt. And so whenever you can do that to make sort of an emotive argument that your gratitude has to come from somewhere, and that comes from your innate sense of God, that's going to help open doors and open conversations for the gospel.
Thank you so much for that, Grant, and thank you for your insight on the show. If you'd like to hear more about just thinking deeply about what's affecting our world today, visit reasons.org and search Reflections. Now we're going to head over to Give and Take, and Jeff will be talking about why we would have ice ages. Let's check it out.
Hello, Jeff Zweerink, and welcome again to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we look at interesting and fascinating scientific topics to explore how they affirm the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by President and founder of Reasons to Believe, Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're going to ask the question, why would God create a planet with ice ages? Hugh, it's good to have you again today.
Thank you.
So this is something, we look through the history of Earth and we see these times where glaciers advanced greatly on the Earth, covered most of the United States, a lot of the Northern Hemisphere, or a lot of the North American continent. And it just kind of makes me ask the question, why would God do something like that? These seem kind of destructive and inhospitable. So what's going on here? What are these ice ages that we're talking about?
Well, our planet has had ice ages in the past, but they've lasted for millions of years. What's unique about the current era is that we have cyclical ice ages.
So this is the advance, retreat.
Yeah, they basically go from 10% of the planet being covered with ice to 20 to 23%. And it's the cyclical nature of this ice age that makes possible the existence of human civilization.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to how that plays into humanity, but let's kind of dig into the details a little bit more. What are the timescales on which these things happen, and how long have they been going on?
Well, the ice age cycle did not start until 2.59 million years ago. Before that, there were no ice age cycles. So it's only in the very recent part of Earth's history.
So we've seen evidence of past ice ages that were much more dramatic, but they weren't cyclical. So that's happened somewhere for basically the last 3 million years. Let's just use that number.
3 billion.
3 million, right?
3 billion. Well, 3 million is where we've had an ice age cycle.
Right, okay, so that's the cycle. And then how frequently do the ice ages happen in this cyclical behavior?
Well, it started off with a 41,000 year periodicity.
Okay.
But for the last 800,000 years, it's been approximately 100,000 year periodicity.
So it almost more than doubled its period. That's kind of remarkable.
It did, and there's some reasons why that was initiated. I've written a few blogs on that. What changed it from because 41,000 years is what you'd normally expect, and that's because of that's the variation in the tilt of our rotation axis.
Okay.
So as it tilts more, the planet gets warmer. As it tilts less, it gets colder, and that's a 41,000-year cycle. The 100,000-year cycle is much more complicated, partly driven by the change in the shape of Earth's orbit about the sun, but there are many other factors involved as well.
I find that interesting because the kind of the expected ice age cycle that you might expect there, the 41,000, while we had that, it's actually much longer, and that seems to be better for large-bodied organisms, particularly like humanity. So is this part of God's design?
I believe so, Jeff, because with a 41,000-year periodicity, the warm interglacial is only about 2,000 or 3,000 years wide. That's not enough time to launch and sustain civilization.
Okay, hold on. Before we move out there, let me just get that. So you got these glacial cycles that last for, say, 100,000 years or 41,000 years.
Right.
You got the warm interglaciers where the glaciers aren't covering most of or a significant part of the planet. Is a few thousand years is all you're talking about. Is that what you're saying?
If it's 41,000 years, you only get a few thousand years of an interglacial. But if it's 100,000 years, you get like 10 to 15,000 years.
That's a significant length.
So that's enough time for we humans to launch civilization.
Now, I know one of the things you talked about in your blog, which we'll reference in a little bit here, is that this last period has had a very remarkably stable climate period, where it typically you see kind of right around that interglacial where it kind of goes up and down, but we've had a remarkably stable climate. What's going on there?
Well, the entire 2.59 million years, the climate's been extremely unstable, more unstable than it's ever been in Earth's history. It's only the interglacial in right now where we've got extreme climate stability.
And what do you mean by extreme climate stability?
The global mean temperature hasn't changed by more than plus or minus 0.65 degrees centigrade in 9,500 years. That's extreme climate stability.
10,000 years and basically half a degree Celsius up or down. That is really remarkable.
It is, yes.
So what goes into this happening? I mean, it doesn't seem expected. Seems like there's got to be a particular set of events that makes it happen.
It's several events that need to happen with perfect timing in order to bring about this stability. That's kind of the core of the blog article I wrote. But probably the most significant is you get a large asteroid hitting in northern Greenland, and it prevents the temperature from going up too high. If you look at the Ice Age cycle, the temperature has been peaking with each Ice Age cycle about 3 degrees centigrade above where it is right now.
Okay.
And it was this particular asteroid collision event that brought about an enormous cooling that prevented the temperature from getting that high. Then there were other events that also occurred that brought about the stability. So it's nothing short, in my opinion, of an amazing miracle that we have all these events coming into sync that give us this unique period of extreme climate stability. But without that, you couldn't have billions of us living here.
Well, and I've read your article enough to know that you look at that peak where it tends to peak right after it peaks, it generally drops down and you go into another ice age.
Exactly.
So we haven't done that either.
Yeah, if it gets too warm, you get an ice age. So,
okay, so this is just pretty remarkable stuff. How would you go about using this information to share the gospel with someone?
Well, just say, isn't it interesting? We've got this period of extreme climate stability at the very same time that we got no nearby supernova. Notice that this period also gives us a fertilization event, 2 simultaneous fertilization events. Yeah, what's happening, Jeff, is that as the ice recedes from the last ice age, these high plateaus get exposed, and you get this powerful wind blowing dust off these high plateaus. That dust is nutrient rich, and it gets dumped on the agricultural plains. At the same time, you've got stimulated volcanic eruptions happening all over the earth, and volcanic material is nutrient rich for agriculture. Combine that with the ice left over from the last ice age. It's the melting of that ice that feeds the great rivers that allow us to irrigate the great agricultural plains. So only if we live in an ice age cycle where we're in an interglacial, where the climate is extremely stable, can we grow enough food to feed billions of people and set enough people free that they can do engineering and science and launch advanced civilization.
I just find that a remarkable thing that this ice age that appears to be detrimental or harmful to the planet actually turns out to be very beneficial to humanity. I mean, we see numbers of places, earthquakes, tectonic activity, even asteroid impacts have played a role in making Earth habitable, if you will. I think that's a pretty remarkable thing. So I appreciate your comments, Hugh. When we investigate how the Earth behaves, there are a number of things that play into just how abundantly and robustly humanity can thrive on our planet. I would encourage you to go check out Hugh Ross's blog, How Did Earth Get Its Stable Climate Cycle? Because you will be equipped to understand all of the different events, the asteroid impacts, the winds, the glacial meltwater that are so vital for an advanced civilization that allows us to spread throughout the Earth and take the gospel to all creation. And you will be better equipped to be part of that great process.
That does it for us this week on 2819.
We hope that you've been really inspired by what you've seen on this show to share your faith and to do so with confidence and compassion.
And if you want to support resources like this show, please visit reasons.org/2819.
And don't forget, grab your phone, hop on your computer, and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear from you.
See you all next time.
Bye.